Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Ely.
And I'm Daniel Chen. We're just a couple guys talking about some stuff.
We're in a series on Counter-Catechesis. So if you want to know our favorite countertypes and what catechesis is, listen to last week's episode.
Yes. Yeah, that's like a big word.
Counter?
Yes, counter. No, counter-catechesis. I don't feel like that's like a normal word used in everyday conversation.
Right.
But is it a really important idea
Yes.
in how we can actually have real conversation with people we disagree with?
Absolutely. So we're talking about basically flipping the narratives of our culture and teaching ourselves and our children and people we disciple how to process the culture and kind of flip the narrative of the culture. We gave an introduction last week, and today we're going to talk about the freedom narrative that exists in our society. So we're going to get into that and how to do counter-catechesis on that. But first, we're going to do our resource of the month. What do you got?
So my resource of the month is a YouTube channel. It's a YouTube channel called Sprouts, and it's like a educational YouTube channel, 5 to 7 minute videos, and they describe, different, psychological theses, or they'll summarize books and do all these things. And so last week I talked about like Graham's arguments or whatever. I got it from Sprouts. I watched a video on it, and it's you don't have to sit there for like 40 minutes and actually dig really deep, but I use it to, and I watch a few a week just to engage my mind, learn something new, think about something in a different way, understand the world as other people are understanding the world. It helps me broaden my perspective, my mind, and what are people learning, what are people studying, what are people thinking.
Nice.
And it really helps me with people,
Sure.
Understanding people.
That's cool.
Yeah. What
That's
about
cool. My resource of the month is a Facebook group that I recently joined called Zoysia Life. I also joined a group called Real Mowers Use Real Mowers, spelled differently. And so we just put down a bunch of zoysia sod in our front backyard, and it's kind of becoming more of a hobby to tend to the zoysia well.
You're like full-on suburbanite
I'm
now.
a full-on suburban dad now. I had a friend come over the other week, and he was like, hey, man, I know this is like super suburban dad thing to say, but I really love the lines in your front yard. I was
Hey.
like, thanks, man.
Wait,
that means
how
a
do you
lot.
cut it? Do you do horizontal? Do you do diagonal?
I have
do you
4
cut it
different
twice?
ways I do it. So I'll go horizontal, then the next week I'll go vertical, then the next week I'll go diagonal to the left, and then the next week diagonal to the right, and then all
Really?
over again.
Interesting.
Want the different...
I used to have a neighbor that would do, I'm not sure it was 4. I think he cut it 3 times. Every time he cut
yeah,
the
that's
lawn.
impressive.
That's too much.
I'm not quite there.
That's too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a bit much. But, so I'm seeing some different... you get problems with your grass, and so I take some pictures and I'll post it on the group. And it is interesting that, people are looking for community, actually, in a lot of ways. So there's 6,000 people in this group, and everyone's posting
It's national
stuff all the
or
time.
in Georgia?
It's national.
Okay.
But so I was having some, patches show up in my lawn. I'm like, is this a fungus, or is this a kind of dry spell or something? So I post something, and I was asking the group about it. And then a fraternity brother of mine replies to it, and he's like, it's either providential that this is happening to you or because you're not praying enough. And I was like, no one else understood that. So then he messaged me, and he's like, hey, man, how you doing? I haven't talked to this guy in like 15 years, That's kind of cool. So join a Facebook group about a hobby and talk to random people.
We rag on social media a lot, but this is one of the cool ways to actually reconnect with people.
Yeah.
And or to connect with new people.
Yeah.
Did you get an answer, by the way? I've had a few patches recently too. I assumed it was a dry spell.
So apparently zoysia can get fungi easily, but this is probably dry spell because I haven't been watering, and it's been so hot and no rain. So that's what I started watering some more yesterday because of it.
Yeah, man, my lawn was like 60 to 70% weeds when we started the year, and had a weed company come out, and they were like, you know, we come kill all these weeds for you, $50 a spray, 8 times a year. I was like, bro, I'm not paying you $400 because my neighbors use the same company and their lawns are twice as big as mine and they pay $25 a spray. And I'm like,
oh, wow.
I can't pay that.
You can't do it.
And so I did it myself, and now my grass is like 95% grass. And
there
it's
you
probably the most proud of anything I've ever done.
You did it.
I was so proud.
Yeah.
So I get the grass thing, man.
Yeah, we've talked about this, especially as pastors. A lot of times you invest in people spiritually and you don't necessarily see the results right away.
Yeah.
But you cut your grass, you see the
it.
result right away.
That is no joke. If you work in a job where you don't get tangible feedback right away, gosh, doing little things like that. That's why I like to garden, actually, and grow vegetables.
Yeah.
Because you
just get to see it.
You get to see the literal fruit come from
Yes.
your plant, right? and that's the same thing with grass. Like, you can see the work that I did and the result of that work.
It's good stuff. So that's my resource of the month. All right, so we're talking about counter-catechesis, and over the next few weeks, we're going to go through different narratives that exist in our society that you probably don't even know they exist, right? That they're just kind of underlying messages that show up in advertisements. Your friends probably talk about it at the coffee shop. They're in all the movies. They don't come out and say it, but they're there. And the one we want to talk about today is the freedom narrative.
And even interesting to that, as you're saying that, it reminds me, you know, these narratives are probably, for some people, a main reason why they have rejected the gospel.
Sure.
But even for Christians, it's probably, American Christians, it's probably seeped into our thinking, and we've actually mixed a little bit of this, each of these things, with our view of the gospel, with our Christianity. And so it's good for us to recognize in other people, but also in ourselves, how if we have bought into some of these narratives.
Right, for sure. So the freedom narrative is the idea, basically, that, I can kind of do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Essentially. And we're using Tim Keller's book, Preaching, Communicating Faith in the Age of Skepticism. He's got a chapter called Preaching and the Late Modern Mind that we're getting this from. But Keller goes back to say that the biblical doctrine and the Protestant doctrine of salvation by faith alone, not our membership in a church or not our participation in a specific class, actually opened the doorway to the idea of freedom, right, that we have today. That, like, if my dad was a blacksmith, I don't have to be a blacksmith. I'm an individual and can be something different,
Right.
So this kind of, I stand before God by myself, not through my parents or not through my class or not through my church. It is this in many ways biblical idea, but Keller says late moderns have gone way past the biblical idea of freedom.
Right.
And it's mainly the classical concept of freedom was freedom to do something. Freedom to use my life to better other people, freedom to invest in my family, freedom to. But we've taken it as freedom from.
Yeah.
Freedom from responsibility, freedom from morality, freedom from constraints. And so we have really radicalized the idea of freedom, even though the bedrock principle of it comes from a biblical kind of Protestant ethic.
Yeah. So even with that, I mean, you take it's in Galatians, it's for freedom that we've been set free, right?
Right.
But what is that freedom to? What does it say right after that? To reject the fruit of the flesh and to do the fruit of the Spirit.
It's freedom to.
Yeah. It's to, now we don't have to be slaves to sin. Now we can be slaves to righteousness. That freedom is actually a resubmission. It's freedom from our sin and a resubmission to God.
Yeah.
It's the freedom to actually choose what is right, to do what is right.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of the freedom from principles actually come from, and I don't know if Keller mentioned that in his book, but a lot of it just has to do with technology. Because it used to be, well, you just marry one of the 3 girls that are within 5 years of you in your town, because there's no such thing as cars to go to a different town.
Sure.
Right? or with colleges, or it used to be even 150 years ago, just really hard to go anywhere, meet people new, to do anything different, because you were kind of stuck in the town that you lived in. And technology has kind of changed everything in that. And technology, in a lot of ways, has helped society, but has also brought along this new freedom problem too, because it's given a opportunity of freedom from that never existed previous to 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Keller basically says embedded in this is this idea of the harm principle. And I guarantee you have heard about this. And the harm principle is basically this: no one can tell me what to do unless it harms others. Right? We hear this kind of all the time. Is you shouldn't tell other people how to live their life unless it's going to create harm on another person.
Right.
And he points out, really helpfully, the problem with this idea is who gets to define harm?
Right.
Who gets to define what's harmful? So he has this great paragraph. This is what he says. He gives the example of pornography. Keller says, one person says that it harms no one for a man to consume pornography privately in his own home. Others counter, however, that pornography will shape how he talks and acts with others, especially with women. Beneath these different conclusions about harm lie different understandings of the right and wrong way for individuals to relate to community. In other words, any decision about what harms others is rooted in specific views of human nature, happiness, and right and wrong, each of which is a matter of faith. So even if we all agree that freedom should be curtailed if it harms people, since we can't agree on what harm is, the principle is useless in practice. And I feel like no one spends enough time digging deep enough to get there, but it's so true. People can do whatever they want as long as it doesn't harm others. Well,
right.
What's harm?
Yeah, and I think with that too, this is just reminding me, a lot of the big movements that's happened in the past 50 years have come from this idea of freedom, right? So like I think about, where does feminism come from, for example? It's the idea of freedom.
Sure.
Right? Or even, we talked a little bit about this last week, the LGBT movement. Where does that come from? The freedom to express myself, to live as I want to, And, even, I listen to, some different conservative commentators. And one thing that I've noticed that is really prominent today is, and I don't know if you've noticed this, is they draw the lines at kids now. So like,
sure,
just, if you want to be gay, be gay. If you want to do this, but leave the kids alone.
Right.
And they've drawn the harm line at kids.
Sure.
But it used to not be there.
Yep.
Like that line has been pushed further and further out.
Mm-hmm.
And for Christians, we have to recognize, well, who's drawing the harm line here?
Yeah, sure.
Because
why is it 18?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so are we letting the Bible draw these lines?
Mm-hmm.
Are we letting the culture draw these lines?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just really important for us to think through these things as we make our decisions about what is right and wrong, what is actually freedom. Sure. Because I love this, who gets to define harm, because if the culture is defining it, man, that's always changing.
Yep. Well, here's an example, right? So talking about the harm line, and this is where we're like on the edge of late modern and postmodern. So a generation ago, trying to physically change your genitalia would be considered harm. Is biological harm to your body.
Right.
You're trying to go through some surgical procedure to change yourself. That would be defined as harm. Okay. Now that we've gone down such a kind of postmodern route, it's considered harm not to let someone do that who wants to do that.
Yeah.
Because the perceived harm is this emotional harm.
Yes.
That you are forcing people into a body that they don't believe that they belong in.
Yeah.
Right.
That the feelings are now what is the most important, even more than the physical.
Yeah, the emotional has transcended the biological.
Yeah.
And well, so who gets to decide what harm is? The guy who says I feel this way, or
Yeah.
the person who says, well, you were literally made this way. Like you should align your feelings with your biology, or do you align your biology with your feelings? And you're going to get a radically different definition of harm based on that. And so you really can't agree on the harm principle just in total practice. Keller goes on to say that this freedom narrative actually thins out pursuing meaning in life. So if the highest meaning in life is just to do whatever you want to, as long as it doesn't harm other people, that doesn't actually make for like a deeply meaningful life. He quotes philosopher Thomas Nagel, who says that we only have real meaning in life if we feel like we're making a difference. But if there's no God, Nagel says, and you write a great work of literature that continues to be read thousands of years from now, but eventually the solar system will cool or the universe will wind down and collapse and all trace of your effort will vanish. If you think about the whole thing, it wouldn't have mattered that you existed. And so if you really trace...
Just words of encouragement for the day.
It's all going to burn down. If you really trace that to its conclusion, there's no way to find meaning in life if you draw out the implications of your belief of the freedom narrative. So you can really only live a meaningful life if you ignore half of what your worldview tells you is the truth. And just living however you want is just not a meaningful way to live.
But you see this play out all the time. I spent 7 years in college ministry. Why do people party and then party more and more and more frequently and crazier?
Yep.
Because the line keeps being pushed back and back, because though it might instantaneously give you what you want in the moment, it can't actually give you that fulfillment as it's talking about. But you see with all of culture why things like have gotten crazier and crazier is because you reach the line and then you're saying, well, that's not enough.
Right.
So you just keep pushing it out.
Yep.
Keep pushing it out. Keep pushing it out. Yeah, that's really insightful.
Keller gives the question on the freedom narrative. Okay, so why help poor people? So if the freedom narrative is true, this we embrace, we can do whatever we want unless it harms people. Why would you help the poor? Why would you help the marginalized? And if you're to be honest, you do it because it makes you feel good. That's the only reason.
Yeah.
And so you would not help poor people if it did not help you
feel good.
And that's pretty shallow.
Yeah.
Like if that's the best that you have, you're really only helping people for your sake, not for their sake. So we have, if the freedom narrative is drawn to its conclusion, we're just a totally selfish society,
right,
that exists for the good of us. And if it happens to benefit you, that's great, but I'm mainly doing it for me.
Right.
And that's not really a way for a good society to actually work.
Yeah, and I think it's because freedom, imagine 350 million people only living for themselves. I'm
right.
like, this is how you self-destruct.
Yep.
If you're not thinking about the people next to you and your neighbors and all this stuff, that's the freedom. I don't know if it comes from or is a good definition for just really our own selfishness.
Sure.
Right? Like this freedom narrative is really the narrative ability to live out your own selfishness.
Mm-hmm. And then Keller points out that it's actually too simplistic of a narrative. So he gives the example of we actually are juggling a bunch of freedoms all at the same time. And making choices in life is about choosing greater freedoms and giving up lesser freedoms. So he gives the example of a musician who wants to become great. Well, okay, you have two freedoms at play here. One is the freedom to practice. Two is the freedom to have free time. Well, if you want to become a great musician, you have to give up the freedom of free time
and
practice. But with giving up that lesser freedom comes the greater freedom of becoming a world-class musician, the greater freedom of being able to play your instrument like no one on earth can. So it's not as simple as saying I'm free to do whatever I want. Well, you have to choose the greater and the lesser. You have to give up one to get another. He gives the example at the most rooted level is love. I mean, what is marriage is turning to someone. The freedom to love you also means
rejecting everyone else,
forsaking all else.
Yeah.
And so love is also self-sacrificial. You sacrifice your preferences and your freedom for the other.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not love.
Yeah.
And so he says that this late modern mind that says, I want a marriage with a partner that just accepts me as I am, like that's a fiction. That's not how marriage actually works. You have to give of yourself.
Yeah.
So there is no love truly in the freedom narrative.
Yeah. And the accepting who you are, I mean, that's just a moving target anyways. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're not the same person as you were 5 years ago, 1 year ago, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's interesting because we went from freedom to freedom from, but there's actually no reality where you're actually free from, I guess, anything in totality, right? You're always submitted to something.
Yeah.
And really what we've done in this narrative is we're free from others, free from God, and free to ourselves. That's what we're choosing, right? Even in those examples. And because I'm just thinking with the practicing the instrument example, like, well, you have two choices of freedom, but you're either now, free to free time or free to practice, but you're really submitting yourself to either your free time or your practice.
Right.
It's not really freedom.
Right.
It's you're submitting. You're choosing to put yourself under either the goal of practice or the goal of doing whatever I want in that time. But it's not, you're not actually free from something. You're still free.
You're submitting to something.
You're submitting to something.
And then there's even the layer of just like, genetically speaking, you may be gifted at the violin or not. And you're really not free to just be. We always say, you tell your kids you can be anything you want. No, you can't.
Yeah.
I'm not free to be an NFL linebacker. Like that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And even if I choose to give up my freedom of, free time, and I practiced all the time and lifted all the time, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So this concept that we have kind of, the Kool-Aid that we have drunk, that you can just be whoever you want to be. I mean, it's a nice motivational thing to tell a 7-year-old when you're trying to say, if you work really hard, you can become a doctor if you want to be. But that phrase is not true.
Yeah.
We are limited by our geography, by our genetics, by our, I'm not free to float to the moon if I want to. It doesn't matter how hard I practice.
Yeah.
They're freedom.
And it's interesting, too, because people have, Americans especially, I mean, our country was started on don't tax me, right? Like, don't tax me, bro. Like, I'm going to throw tea in this, in the water or whatever. And so the highest goal for Americans, whether it's on the left or the right, I've seen this, is this idea of freedom. But freedom in itself is not something to achieve because it's not the end goal. Freedom in itself cannot be the end goal, but it has become the end goal for a lot of people.
Yes.
Because the question is freedom to do what?
Right.
What do you do with your freedom?
Right.
Because you know what? If you want to murder people, I'm not going to cheer your freedom to murder people.
Exactly.
Because that's wrong.
Yep.
And so we have to draw these lines to say, you know what's more important than freedom? Goodness, righteousness, flourishing in society, flourishing. And so a lot of people, we stop at freedom, but really we need to go the next step and to think about, to talk about, what does the freedom accomplish? What is actually the end goal? And I think if, for a lot of people, freedom has become the end goal, and if it is the end goal, we've already missed.
That's good.
And I think that's what Keller's talking about. It's not enough. It can't. Like, you're aiming way too low as freedom as the end goal, as the ultimate.
Right. He says, freedom is not then simply the absence of restrictions, but rather consists in finding the right liberating restrictions. Put another way, we must actively take tactical freedom losses in order to receive strategic freedom gains. You grow only as you lose some lower kinds of freedom to gain higher kinds. So there is no absolute negative freedom. And he talks about how, this is really what love is, He says, in marriage, we might say we lose our independence in order to gain a new freedom. So if we give ourselves to our God, our true love, we will become more free than we can imagine. We will be free from fears, insecurity, and shame. We will be free to forgive, to love others, to face suffering in a way that we could not have before. So yeah, it's reframing, and this is what he's doing with Counter-Catechesis, right? He's showing your concept of freedom doesn't work. It leads to a totally self-centered society that has no baseline understanding of what harm is, and actually makes a loveless society. Like, love cannot flourish in the freedom narrative. And what you really want...
Because love for others doesn't exist.
Right.
If the only thing that exists is love for self.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're just a bunch of narcissists, looking at yourself in the pool of water. So I guess, we can kind of give a summary, I suppose, of, we talked about last week that kind of 4 steps are recognize, affirm, subvert, fulfill.
Yeah.
So in the freedom narrative, how does that work, right? So recognizing that the narrative out there is we should be free to do whatever we want. That's kind of what we're hearing. We can affirm that, the Bible does teach that we are made as individuals, that we have a will, and it's great that we do live in a society that doesn't force us to basically fit the mold of our parents. I mentioned the blacksmith thing. Back in the day, if your dad was a blacksmith, you were. And so it's great that we live in a society where that doesn't have to be the case. You can pick a career path that fits your talents and your gifts. But the subversion is this kind of freedom never leads to love. It always leads to, self-fulfillment. You sacrifice others for the fulfillment of yourself, and it leads to a million different definitions of what harm is. And so there's no unity. The foundational blocks of society are eroded. But the fulfillment is in the gospel. Jesus gave up his freedom to rescue us, and we get to give up lesser freedoms to gain a greater one. Freedom from eternal life, freedom from shame, freedom from guilt, freedom to live forever.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the summary.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think learning to recognize, I feel like recognize and subvert are the hardest for me.
Yeah, to see it out there and then to flip it.
Yeah, to flip it.
Yep.
Because, and what we want to hear is like, this is one way that you can recognize, affirm, subvert, and fulfill, but there's a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because I think about like the idea of freedom and how even now it's something like 90% of arranged marriages stay together, and it's like 50 for us in the West.
Wow.
Like even now. And it's like, what does that tell you? The freedom isn't actually accomplishing what you think it is.
Yes.
Or there's like a really famous TED Talk about how this guy went to the store and there was like 100 different options for jeans, and he was just like paralyzed. It's like analysis paralysis, right? There's so many options now that he gets to choose, and it's actually easier if it was like, here's the one pair of jeans for your size that you can buy.
It's like, oh, great.
There's actually more freedom.
Yes.
There's actually more freedom in the non-freedom there.
Yeah, makes
right?
total sense.
And what you see just from those couple examples is that freedom is actually not accomplishing what people think it is.
Freedom doesn't breed fulfillment the way you think it will.
And the true freedom is really just in the gospel, to be free from sin, to submit yourself to Christ.
Yeah.
That's the true freedom that you can actually have.
Yeah.
But I think you see this in society. I mean, I'm glad we started with this one, because I feel like this is the basis of all a lot of other narratives.
Yep.
Is it comes from this idea of wanting to be your freest self,
Right.
but really it's just caused more and more and more problems and insanity, really, in the world.
You know, it's we were talking before we pressed record on Frozen.
Yep.
And I was saying, I think it's kind of funny because I think Frozen starts out with the freedom narrative.
Right.
And it's let it go, and I'm going to leave everyone's expectations and do what I want and build this, castle of ice or whatever. But I think they like accidentally subvert that narrative because by the end of the movie, it is self-sacrifice that wins the day.
Right.
And like going alone by yourself, defining who you are, making your own ice castle in the middle of nowhere actually leads to disaster for everyone.
Right.
And so to me, it's kind of funny that in order to make a good movie, you actually can't like the freedom narrative will not deliver you a good movie if you trace it out all the way.
Yeah. What a great point, because what if it ended with her in her castle
That's
and
it.
like the snow monster throwing them out? And
Right.
it was like black screen, the end.
Are we glad she gets to be whoever she wants to be?
Yeah. Yeah,
I'd be
so-
like, that's a terrible movie.
And what people don't see is that's how people are trying to live their lives.
Yes. It doesn't work.
No. And actually, at the end, it's like she realizes that her purpose is to care for those in the town or whatever.
Right.
Arendelle. Did I get that right? That's so funny.
I
I've
was
seen
going to
it like
say
20
it, but I
times.
didn't want to confess that I know it.
I've
so.
seen that movie 50 times.
Yeah,
And
it's a frequent one in the Ely household.
Yeah, I don't know how I don't know more names and stuff. I guess I'm not paying. I don't know. I call the moose the guy and all the stuff. I mix up all the names. So
yeah. So that's it on the freedom narrative. Next week we'll be back by talking about the morality justice narrative. So a lot to discuss there. Thanks for joining us for this week. Talk to you next.